Welcome back to Culturally Booksmart. My name is Shantea Lewis, and I'm so happy to have you join me on this beautiful Wednesday. So, my apologies for not having today's book review ready for Monday. I was busy with other commitments, but I'm here and I'm excited to get into today's book review. I want to note that the book that I'm reviewing today is very long and it contains many themes that I wish I had the time to dissect. However, I'm only going to dissect one major theme within the book, just so that you guys have an idea of what it's about and you will be able to determine whether or not it's a book that you want to read. Um, and also, I wanted to place emphasis on the fact that we are now, and that I'm now at 100 subscribers. So I'm so happy to be growing a community of book lovers. It's very refreshing to know that you guys enjoy books the way that I enjoy books. I feel like we do live in a digital era where a lot of people spend most of their times on their phone and they get lost in social media and other people's lives. And I'm really hoping that over time, people begin to start getting more lost in a book and in fictional stories or historical stories. So I'm so happy to have you guys a part of this community. Now that we're at 100 subscribers, I don't know what I can do to celebrate. I don't know if I should do a giveaway. So please let me know what you guys would like for me to do to celebrate the 100 subscribers. I really want to show my appreciation for you guys supporting me and being a part of this community. And I would also like for you guys to tell me, like, what are some books or genres, that are aligned with BIPOC cultures, that you guys are interested in. I want to make content and review books that you guys are reading or you guys want a second opinion on. So, yes, please let me know. I'm trying to add different books that I think are interesting. However, what I think is different from what I know. So if you guys can tell me what you guys like, that would help me a lot and we can be able to like dissect these books together. So recently I bought some new books from Chapters. I got what is it called? I got Burn Down Master's House, which I'm really excited for. I also got a Black Queer History, so it's up there on the shelf. And I also have um, The Knowing, which is about Indigenous peoples in Canada and the struggles that they've gone through as a result of colonialism and settle, European settling into Canada and creating the country that we all know to be Canada. So yeah, so those are the three books that I've gotten. I'm excited to read them. However, next week's books is going to be centered on the Seven Daughters of Dupree and With Love from Harlem. So I'm super excited for both those books because at least it's not so historically dense, like with so much information and group, like, because I feel like I've been touching on a lot of heavy historical and cultural like facts. So I'm really happy to step into the world of fiction where I can kind of give my mind a break and also give you guys a break on heavy topics. So I'm really looking forward to both reading those two books. And I'm hoping that it's more of a faster read. The book that I'm reviewing today took me 3 days to read, and it's 3 days of like outside of work, not having a life. Like, yeah, it got to the point where I even Googled, like, why is this book so long? Because I'm like, okay, this is a lot. So, yeah, so that's basically it. Um, and yeah, I'm super happy to have 100 subscribers. I know I've said it already, but I'm extremely happy. It was a goal of mine, but for it to happen in fruition is very encouraging. And I just hope that we continue to grow and we continue to really spotlight books, because eventually I also want to start critiquing books too. I don't always want to be like super like nice about a book and be like, oh my God, it was great. Like, I also want to have some un unpopular opinions on books that some people are scared. Like, for example, if the plot is boring, I want to be able to say that, and without feeling like, oh my gosh, like I'm being too brash. So that's also what I'm excited for too. I was also thinking of maybe adding like an audio version. For example, if I'm referencing like a certain passage within the book, I was thinking of having like someone, like, I don't know, like a robot or something, like read that passage. And then after listening to that passage, and I can give my own little critique and my own opinion on what was written. So tell me, let me know if you guys like that idea. But again, like, I really need you guys to tell me what you're reading, because I really want to know and I want to feel more connected with you guys. Like, I know that you guys are there, but I want to have a conversation with you guys and really understand like what it is that's keeping you interested in the book world. So, yeah, I'm excited. So, we're going to get into today's book, which is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But before we get into today's book review, I do want to focus on the latest news in the literary world. Then we're going to transition into the book review. And then after we transition into the book review, I am going to give my final thoughts on it. And then we're going to transition into the literary junk row of the day, which is all comical fun, is just to make fun or light of a stupid comment that was made by someone within the literary world. So that's something that I also wanted to spotlight as well. But yeah, this is the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's only, how much pages is this? So it is 354 pages, but let me tell you, it's 354 pages, but the texts are so small. And you know what? We know what may have progressed my reading, like really delayed my reading, is that I was intentionally taking notes of everything, because I really wanted to have a good understanding of the message of what he was trying to say, and etc. So I think that's another reason why it took me some time to read the book, because from what I've heard, this book is life changing, and let me tell you, like, it definitely changed my perspective of the world that we live in. It changed my perspective on racism 100%, because this book really gives you a good idea of the source of racism. So overall, this book, I would say, is extremely informative, but we're going to get down more into it. Um, momentarily in the book review. But for right now, we are going to transition into the literary publishing news. So, in today's literary news, I wanted to spotlight an article published by the New York Times titled An Illustrated History of Giants and Geniuses Who Transformed Basketball by Celia McGee. So, this article was published to spotlight the children's book Basketball, the Story of the All-American Camp by Kadir Nelson. So, I decided to make this part of this episode's latest news because, for one, as a child, I loved basketball. That was my favorite sport. It was a sport that I was able to connect with my dad. I think that was one of the number one reasons why I had a great relationship with my dad as a kid. And also because as a child, I also played basketball recreationally. And yeah, recreationally, because I wouldn't say professionally because I wasn't getting paid, but recreationally, my friends and we played rep basketball, and we had the opportunity to verse other teams throughout Ontario, which was fun. It was good for character development. It was good for um, social skills, and it's a very good way to develop young kids to acquire certain skills. So when I saw this book, I love the fact that Kadir Nelson was creating a sports book for kids who loved the sport of basketball. So the book Basketball, the story of the All-American camp is basically a book that has a series of illustrations where children are able to learn about the women and male pioneers of basketball. And I just find that very cool because at least with these kids, because a lot of these basketball players, female and male that are referenced in the book are no longer playing in the NBA. So it's good that these kids are able to see who were the trailblazers back then and how these trailblazers opened up doors for the present day basketball players. And I feel like that it's good to spotlight this book because if there's any parents that are listening to this podcast, I find it extremely important for kids to start to become inspired of people that have done amazing things within certain um, industries or career paths, and for kids to, um, be inspired and also hopefully start to figure out what are some things that they're passionate about. And yeah, and I think it's a great thing to for kids to have as maybe like a birth, like I don't know, just for kids to have. So that was something that was, grabbed my attention, and I I may get this book for a young cousin of mine if, you know, because it's I'm sure it's a great book. So now we're going to transition into there is a book titled Until the Last Gun is Silent: A Story of Patriotism, the Vietnam War, and the Fight to Save America's Soul. So this book, written by Matthew Delmont, was published last week, so on January 27th, and the book, and I quote, shares the untold story of Black patriots from soldiers in combat to peace protesters who ended the Vietnam War and fended the soil of American democracy, from a preeminent civil rights historian at the award-winning author of Half American. So to start, once I read the synopsis of this book, I knew immediately that I needed to add it to my reading list. The reason why I needed to add this to my reading list, and it is presently on my reading list to purchase, is that I'm excited to read about the different perspectives that Coretta Scott King, who we know is Martin Luther King's wife, and who also championed the anti-war cause, and how different her perspective was to Dwight Skip Johnson, who was a Medal of Honor recipient who fought in the Vietnam War. So it'll be interesting to read about the forces at play that compelled Black men to fight in the Vietnam War on behalf of the American government, and their treatment once they returned to America after fighting in the Vietnam War. Because based on, some people's experiences, or the stories of those that fought, Black men that fought in the Vietnam War, they weren't treated the best, as a result of the racial hostility that was taking place in America during that time. So it'd be interesting to see, um, what compelled someone like Dwight Skip Johnson from, deciding to become a soldier in this war, and also the the refuting perspectives that Coretta Scott had as a result of American the American government using Black bodies to fight in a war, to fight in this war. So I'm really excited for this book. It's funny because I feel like not a lot of publicity was made to this book, but I don't know. I just have a weird thing with war and Black men fighting in war. I know this may be an unpopular opinion, but I don't believe that Black men should fight in any of these Western countries. I understand that, yes, certain war, at least they frame it where they're protecting our rights and they're protecting our safety and etc. But, and things are getting better. Like the racism isn't as explicit as it was before. However, do I feel that the Black man is valued in comparison to the white man? No, I don't. So as a result, I don't feel that the Black man should have to sacrifice his body for a society that doesn't value him wholly. I do not agree with that, and I don't. So so as before I read this book, I already have my own beliefs already. So I'm interested to see whether or not the story of, you know, what's his name? The story of uh Dwight Skip Johnson really changes my mind on that. I doubt it, but yeah. So I'm not an advocate for war. I'm not an advocate for um Black men, Black women participating in um, Western warfare. That's just me. I'm open to hearing other people's opinions as long as it's respectful, but that's just my opinion, and it's not going to change unless someone has a very compelling argument. Um, that's, yeah, unless you have a compelling argument to make me not feel that way, it's going to stay that. It's my opinion is going to stay like that. So those are the two latest news for today. So one, it is Until the Last Gun is Silent, a story of patriotism, the Vietnam War, and the fight to save America's soul by Matthew Delmont. Please add that to your reading list because I am going to do a book review on that book. And I think that's going to be a really good review. And then also, about the book based on the pioneers in basketball, which is a great book for young kids who love the sport and who want to have a piece of history in the form of literary art, which is a great thing for young kids to have. So, yeah, that is today's latest news. Okay, so before getting into the book review, I want to provide info on the writer of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and his name is Walter Rodney. So, Walter Rodney is a revolutionary, intellectual, socialist, and Pan Africanist. Dr. Rodney was a Guyanese historian, political activist, and academic who revolutionized the understanding of the underdevelopment of Africa through a Marxist Pan-Africanist lens. So prior to reading this book, I was extremely excited to begin this literary journey with Walter Rodney as my narrator because, for one, I like to read about Black history by a Black person. I don't like my history to be told by someone that doesn't look like me, nor lived it, nor has any sort of ancestral connection to it. So that was the number one reason why I decided to get the book. And number two, because like I previously said, he's a revolutionary intellectual and he spent, a lot of his earlier life researching a lot of the things that are in this book. So we're gonna get into that now. So this book is guided and was researched through the lens of Marxism. So the Marxist theory was based on the idea that the economic base of society consisted of production and labor, fundamentally shaping all legal, political, and cultural institutions. And it viewed human history as a series of class struggles between an elite ruling class that owns the means of production and a working class that is systemically exploited for profit. So it is this ideology that guides chapters 4 to 6 throughout the book. So we're going to focus on each chapter on how this guides each chapter. So in chapter 4, Rodney details the commencement of European capitalism in Africa and the underdevelopment of Africa as a result of the loss of human capital. So in the book, Walter Rodney states that a study suggested that a figure of about 1 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, and Europe. So these people were taken during their childbearing age, and as a result, this affected the population of Africa because since in the millions were taken from Africa who were going to be the future producers of future generations, there was a stagnancy in terms of the birth rates. So that really affected the human capital available in Africa. And on the contrary, because the Europeans were taking slaves from Africa, this actually improved their human capital. Specifically, Walter Rodney states that population growth played a major role in European development in providing labor, markets, and the pressures which led to further advance. And as a result, the Europeans, namely the Portuguese, used their gained human capital for the extraction of gold in Brazil. So if we do a little backstory, Western Africa and through the Sahara Desert was known to be the gold capital, at least in Africa. So because now, since the Europeans discovered gold in Brazil, they had no reason to foster the relationship that they had with the Africans as after. So once they discovered gold in Africa, their number one relationship between a lot of the African nations were based on the selling of slaves, so that these slaves were then taken to these places to extract the resources that they previously bought from Africa. So I want to note that during the slave trade, many of African nations tried to um, get to end the slave trade and base their economy on something outside of the selling of slaves. However, the Europeans made it very difficult to do so. So I want to note that African states like Dahomey in the 18th century, so they're one of these nations that try to end slavery. For example, King Agaja Trudeau attempted to break the slave trade by attacking European coastal forts, though he was later compelled to compromise due to the need for firearms. In addition to this, so African nations asked for assistance in transitioning their economy from being reliant on the sale of slaves. However, the Europeans did not assist with this. So any way for the Europeans to, not Europeans, but African nations to, develop their own societies without having to gain money through the use, or not money, but just things through the use of slaves, the Europeans were not interested in supporting. So that was one of the major takeaways of chapter 4. So now we're going to transition into chapter 5. So through a Marxist lens, Walter Rodney analyzes the European exploitation of Africans during the colonial period. So during the colonial period, African labor was undervalued, and as such, African workers weren't paid a human wage. So Walter Rodney specifically states that wages paid to workers in Europe and North America were much higher than the wages paid to African workers in comparable categories. For example, the Nigerian coal miner at Enugu earned 1 shilling per day for working underground and 9 pence per day for jobs on the surface. Such a miserable wage would be beyond comprehension of a Scottish or German coal miner who could virtually earn in 1 hour what the Enugu miner was paid for a 6-day week. So that description alone should illustrate to you the discrepancy in pay between European workers and African workers, where African workers were heavily exploited in order to provide these European companies um, as much profit as possible, which present day we know to be inhumane, right? So, in addition to this, foreign capitalists made it a priority to be inhumanely extracted from African culture. So, in North Africa, foreign capital exploited natural resources of phosphates, oil, lead, zinc, manganese and iron ore. In Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, there were important workings of gold, diamonds, iron ore, and bauxite. For instance, after the Kenyan highlands been declared crown land, the British handed over to Lord Delaware 100,000 acres of the best land at a cost of a penny per acre. Needless to say, such plantations made huge profits. So the reason why I'm giving examples even of Lord Delaware, who paid pennies per acre for $100,000 acre, just showed that the Europeans did everything that they could to not only exploit the land, African land, but to also undervalue it so that that way they can make a huge profit, and the African societies that they were buying it for made nothing from the sale of whatever, for example, the sale of land or the sale of resources that were taken from the land. So that's another thing. That's another thing that Walter Rodney does a great job in providing details in, is to show of how Europe over exploited Africa to the point where African workers and just African people in general were not given a fair compensation in comparison to their European counterparts. So at the end of chapter 6, Walter Rodney does an excellent job in illustrating Marxist theory that eventually capitalism's inherently exploitive nature, driving a class struggle between the bourgeois, the owners and the workers, ultimately aiming to a communist society. So he doesn't spend a lot of time showing that the clash between the workers and the owners will eventually turn into a communist society. However, he does show that a clash between the workers and the owners was something that took place in Africa. And this all started from the unequal distribution of social benefits amongst Black and whites. For example, he states that the limited social services within Africa during colonial times were distributed in a manner that reflected the pattern of domination and exploitation. In Algeria, the figure for infant mortality was 39 per 1,000 live births among white settlers, but it jumped to 170 per 1,000 live births in the case of Algerians living in the towns. In addition to this, the educational system within countries like Tanganyika, which I believe is present-day Tanzania, purposefully focused on a Eurocentric educational system. However, the educational system within Tanganyika actually drove a class struggle between the workers and the owners. For example, in the 1940s, Africans sought to change features of the educational system that they naturally had to demand a voice in councils that operated educational policy. So Africans wanted their educational systems to reflect Africa and not just European teachings, because even at some point in the book, they wanted they wanted the educational system to to speak about the royal family and things that the African peoples could not relate to, rather than focus on the rivers that or the African geography or African culture. And that it was purely Eurocentric, and a lot of and like Walter Rodney stated in the 1940s, Africans demanded that the educational system was Afrocentric rather than Eurocentric. So, in conclusion, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, to me, was the greatest history lesson I have received on imperialism and colonialism of Africa. In addition to this, it does a great job in illustrating the intersectionality of racism and capitalism. Once you read the book, you may agree or disagree. And overall, I love the book. The book was very thorough. He provides so much information on the current. So, for example, there's current day businesses that he mentions in here that profited from the exploitation of Africa, and why these companies were able to be as successful as they are as a result of the high profits that they earned from underpaying African workers. He also benefits the over exploitation, or not even over, just the exploitation of Africa, to why Europe was able to develop technologically as advanced as they did. For example, he credits the copper that was mined from Liberia, and why that was instrumental in the technological weapons and that modern day European nations have. He credits a lot of the materials that were taken from Africa for little or nothing as the reason why a lot of these European nations are trailblazers, or not trailblazers, but have nuclear weapons and have weapons of mass destruction. And he ultimately states that the exploitation of Africa is sourced from the one fundamental thing, and that is capitalism. Once Europe changed from communalism to feudalism, and then eventually from feudalism to capitalism, that's when there was a shift in terms of the exploitation of African workers, where African workers and the African land was basically used to continue to develop Europe and to continue to develop European wealth. So overall, this book was great because it makes you realize how intentional the undervaluing of African land was in order to, ensure European wealth and and European profits. And it gives you enough knowledge for you to, you know, it gives you enough knowledge for you to be aware of history. And for example, I know for a fact that I'm not going to be purchasing any products that are under Unilever, just because Unilever was one of those companies during colonial times that exploited Africa and African workers. And it's important that people read books like this, because then you'll be able to know what companies to support, especially if you are if you are a Black person who unfortunately, whose whose ancestors were unfortunately taken advantage of to put, money in these people's pockets. So Again, this book is extremely important if you really want to understand why Africa, you know, is not at the scale in terms of resource wise. Yes, Africa is very wealthy, but in terms of capital, why Europe continues to be a trailblazer in that. And this book gives you a really thorough breakdown of why it starts from pre-colonial Africa to colonial Africa, and then it then transitions to um, how how Africa contributed to the capitalist development of Europe. And yeah, so he just basically takes you on a historical journey of of the different social system change, how the social system changes led to the exploitation of Africa, and how the exploitation of Africa ultimately benefited um, European companies and European nations. So overall, this book was really great. I loved it. I mean, it definitely is not a easy read or a fast read. It's definitely a read where you would want to make sure that you are absorbing as much information, making highlights. For example, the amount of highlights that I made in this book is insane. Just because I wanted to always if I wanted to reference back to this book if I needed to, and that's the reason why I made notes and I folded pages, because a lot of every single page in this book is provides crucial information to why Africa, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, sorry. So he does a great job in writing this book, and I can tell that this book took years of research for Walter Rodney to do, but it was necessary, and I think it's a must read for um, anyone that's BIPOC, because ultimately, as all BIPOC people, we can relate to the over exploitation of our lands as a result of European colonialism and imperialism and capitalism. And he does a great job in doing that. But he also, what I love about the book is that he doesn't push for hate. He kind of subtly alludes to racism being a byproduct of capitalism, and it was just a way of just racism was a way of justifying why Africans deserve to be underpaid, because in order to justify them high profits and Africans not making a lot of money, they needed to somehow say, okay, well, they're inferior is the reason why we're not going to pay them the money that they deserve. So again, when you're reading this, after you're reading this book, you're not going to find yourself angry or full of hate as a result of the history of it. You're just going to realize that people, specifically these Europeans, these capitalists, just really played with human psychology in order to reap the financial benefits that they did. So overall, I love the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I highly recommend this book for anyone in university, anyone who's looking for a leisurely read to understand how the world works, world history, and the motives behind the slave trade, the motives behind the exploitation of Africa. It's just the list goes on. Like there's so much reasons why it's necessary to read this book, and I highly recommend it. Again, it's not an easy read, but if you enjoy books like this, then it won't be that much of an issue. So overall, this book, would I say it's life changing? Yes, because this is information that is not just freely given within the media or even in some school educational systems. Like they're not going to really teach you the things that Walter Rodney mentions in this. I don't think even universities, because I've taken some classes. What have I taken? No, I've taken like Caribbean history class, but even then, like this book was never recommended. So again, if you really want to really educate yourself outside of these European educational systems that probably won't really recommend these books in the classroom, I highly recommend that you read this because it is a must read.
Today's literary.
Dirty Drunkro. Drunkro.
So today's literary junk bro goes out to the source quoted in David Spector's New York Post article stating, Mamdani school chancellor picking idiots and an ideologue to lead the nation's largest educational system. This critic even goes on to say that socialist Mayor Zoran Mamdani school's chancellor is race-obsessed for extreme leftist anti-merit policy, critics told the Post. So who is Kamar Samuels? So Kamar Samuels is a longtime educator who served as the superintendent of school districts repping parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn before Mamdani tapped him to head the nation's largest school system. So the longtime educator promoted and hosted multiple anti-racist town halls events in both boroughs dedicated to pushing a woke agenda in the name of equity. So guest speakers included far-left Brooklyn councilwoman Crystal Hudson in February 2022. So the reason why this critic, this unnamed critic is getting literary junker of the day, because it's like as a chancellor, right? A school chancellor. Wouldn't you want your school chancellor to be someone that is focused on equity, to ensuring that kids are, treated fairly and justly within the classroom and teachers aren't grading or educating students from a place of racial bias, especially in a democratic society. To me, it just seems like this critic is just looking for something stupid to say. So that's why I decided to give this critic junk bro of the day. I don't like even wasting my time speaking about stupid people like this, but I had to give spotlight to this because this article has no merit, has no substance, and it seems very juvenile for someone to make themselves believe that because a person believes in anti-racist policies, they're now not a good fit to be a school chancellor. So anyways, this person's getting junker of the day. This was a very quick junker of the day. I'm not going to even give him 7 more minutes of my time. If you guys read the article, I'm going to post the article somewhere, an image, and you guys can read this foolishness for yourself. But yeah, this critic is junk bro, literary junk bro of the day.